Hello and welcome back to the channel. I am the Sunny Machine. Today I'm going to start exploring my setup with you. This is what my setup currently looks like. Here is a very complicated graphic of what my setup currently looks like. This is insane. I have a ridiculous amount of HDMI cables. This isn't even really the full picture of my setup. This is a very simplified view. There are extra monitors and extra capture cards. There are all kinds of things hooked up in my setup, but in order to not overwhelm you, we're just going to simplify with what you see here. We're going to start at the beginning of the chain. I want to talk to you about HDMI switches and what these are good for and why you might want one. So there's two kinds of HDMI switches that I've used in my setup, and that is one of these, which you might have seen before. They sell for incredibly cheap on eBay and Amazon. So let's talk about what these are real quick. These are actually auto selector HDMI switches. It has inputs and one output. So let's say you have a capture card. You've got a bunch of game consoles you'd like to hook up to your capture card. You can plug in 5 different consoles with this and then send the output to your capture card. And the really nice thing is it will auto switch between devices when you turn a new device on. I have had issues with that working for some devices. Some things I have plugged in will send a constant signal, and so it will get stuck on one of the inputs and it won't change, so you have to push the button or use the little remote it comes with. Now they have variations of these cheap devices on Amazon. The one I really want to focus on that I think is worth the investment, it's 3 times the price of these little cheap guys in most cases, but it's way more reliable. These are much more affordable than this, but I do recommend using these eventually in your setup over the cheap $12, $15 HDMI switchers. I used these for a very long time. They are sort of reliable. They work most of the time, but I eventually ran into some issues using them, especially once I started adding a lot more complicated equipment down the line. You can start off with these and you can get away with a lot, especially if you're not using Sony consoles in your setup. These will work really well with Xbox and Nintendo Switch, Nintendo Wii, with an HDMI adapter, RetroTinks, all that kind of stuff. At least the RetroTink 2X and the 2XM will work on these. But if you start getting more complicated scalers and devices in your setup and things like the Sony PlayStation, things can get a little not working. That's why I switched over to using these entirely in my setup. Now, the price on these is a lot higher. So the question is, why would I get this? Well, first of all, these have been incredibly reliable in fixing signal issues in my setup, especially when it comes to the PlayStation 3 and the PS4. Those consoles, half the time when I'm using the cheaper HDMI switch, it just won't send a signal through. I am no longer spending time turning consoles on, waiting for them to show up, not seeing any signal on my capture card or my TV, and trying to figure out, is the cable loose? Am I not on the right input? Do I need to switch things? All of the troubleshooting goes away. And when you have a very complicated setup like you've seen in my diagram, you don't really want to waste any time troubleshooting. Where's the broken link? Is it this? Is it that? How far down the chain is it going to be? So the more complicated your stream setup or your content creation setup gets, the more it benefits you to have good equipment that is reliable and just works when you want it to. So these are about $45 on Amazon. I think you can usually get a coupon for a discount, so make sure you look and see if there's a little box you can click to get some money off. But I've tried multiple HDMI auto switchers, and honestly, these are as good as the regular, more expensive ones, the ones that are $20, $25. They have the same technical issues and problems that I've run into with those kind of like, maybe if I spend a little bit more, I'll get more. The SGEYR, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, has been the most reliable when it comes to anything that is HDMI 2.0 and backwards. So this will only do 4K 60, but it will do HDR and it will do 4K 60 really well. It does HDCP 2.2. If you guys don't know what that stuff is, it doesn't matter. It will work with your consoles. It will still work with an Xbox Series X and a PlayStation 5, and so will this, but it will be less reliable, especially on the Sony devices. So you're not going to get VRR and you're not going to get all the fancy HDMI 2.1 spec out of this device. That's not what it's for. We're still waiting on those, and I will probably upgrade to at least one of those in my setup for the newer consoles when those do release and they are affordable. $45 is a lot to spend on an HDMI switch, and I have 3 of these in my setup. That's a lot, so that's a pretty big investment, but for me it was worth it because I got rid of spending a ton of time checking cables and troubleshooting things. That's why I invested in this. And it's the same concept as the other selector. It's got a single output and it's got 5 HDMI inputs. It has a 5-volt DC power input, and so does this, but I find that the 5-volt DC power on these cheap guys is less reliable, or it doesn't actually supply enough, or it fights with the built-in power on the HDMI, and that's where I was having compatibility issues. I would turn the PlayStation 3 on, and I'd literally just get nothing. I'd get no signal whatsoever. I was constantly fighting with the PS3 and the PS4 Pro on this, so I felt like it was time to try something different. And that's why I landed on this guy. This has worked completely reliably. Something to do with the 5-volt power coming in, supplying power to the HDMI rails, allows the PS3 to actually realize that there's something connected to the console and send the signal properly. This, if you have a PlayStation 3, I highly recommend you just invest in one of these, and you want to use your PlayStation or your PS4 on your capture card. This is not going to strip the HDCP out of the signal. You're going to want to use a different device for that, which I'll talk about in a different video in the future as we work down the signal path of my setup. We'll get to that. But you can use this to hook up a bunch of consoles to a capture card, or you can hook it up to audio extractors and then send that to your capture card. There's all kinds of great stuff you can do with this. The only real downside and annoyance that I've found with this box is that the power LED is so bright. I have to put a small piece of electrical tape over the power button to kind of make it not blast my room because it just stays on all the time. The nice thing though is if you have a device that isn't sending a constant signal, the green lights will not be on. It will not come on at all. The one other downside with this is the remote. The remote works great. There's no problem with it, but it's the only way to turn this device on and off. If you have some other kind of infrared remote in the room that for some reason triggers the power to trip on this, turning this on and off is going to require this remote, which is massively annoying because I do have remotes for other devices in my room, like lights, that have turned these off without me realizing it. For some reason, the power or one of the color buttons on here is the same signal as the power on this device. So you have to be kind of mindful of that. So just keep the remote nearby. If you buy multiples of these, they will all come with a remote, and all the remotes will work between all the devices. So that's one of the good things, is that you can have backup remotes. But this has to be working as well and is running on CR2032 batteries. So make sure you have batteries because you won't be able to turn this back on without the remote. Okay, so those are the pros and cons. The next video, I'm going to focus on something that's probably a bit more interesting for streamers, which is HDMI matrix. An HDMI matrix is a lot like this switcher box, except it has 2 outputs, and you can send any of the inputs to any of the outputs. And I like to use a specific version that has headphone jacks on it so that you can extract the audio to send to your soundboard for your game consoles, which is really helpful. In most cases, you can get all of your console's audio sent to a soundboard using an HDMI matrix. So that'll be next week's video. If you have any questions, leave a comment below and I will try to answer them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe.